Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the counter. The newspaper in front of him lay untouched, a cup of coffee cooling beside it. His thoughts were elsewhere, trapped in the fog of uncertainty that had settled over the past few weeks. Sophia, his wife of 12 years, had been acting distant. At first, Ethan thought it was just the pressures of her work or maybe a phase she was going through, but then the small changes began to pile up. Her late nights, the sudden need for space, and the odd way she always seemed to be rushing out the door or buried in her phone. The whispers in his mind grew louder, and the unease festered into something more substantial. But he didn't want to believe it, not yet. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Sophia dropped the bombshell. She had stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her posture poised and serene as always. But her eyes were avoiding his. "I'm going to help Jennifer with her house sitting," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's just for the weekend. She needs someone to stay over and take care of the place while she's away." Ethan had nodded, trying to push down the irritation that rose in his chest. Jennifer was a longtime friend of Sophia's, someone he barely knew, but that wasn't the issue. It was the suddenness of it all. He'd assumed they had plans. Dinner with friends, perhaps a quiet evening at home. Yet Sophia was already packing her things, an energy about her that told him she was eager to leave. "It's fine," Ethan had said, trying to sound casual. "I'll be here." And so she left. With a quick kiss on his cheek and a tight smile, she was gone. For the next few hours, Ethan tried to bury the nagging doubts that clawed at his mind. He focused on the mundane tasks, tidying the house, catching up on work, maybe watching a show or two, but the unease wouldn't leave him. There was something about the way she'd spoken, the way her eyes had flickered when she mentioned Jennifer. It felt rehearsed, like she was performing the role of a dutiful wife. And when he asked her about the details, how long would she be gone, when would she be back, her responses were quick, clipped, lacking the usual warmth. As the evening wore on and the hours stretched late into the night, Ethan found himself unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He checked his phone. No messages from Sophia. No calls. "She's probably busy," he muttered to himself, trying to brush off the growing discomfort. But the next morning, the nagging feeling hadn't gone away. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling at him, urging him to act, to find out what was really going on. The worst part? He didn't know why he felt so sure something was wrong. He trusted Sophia, didn't he? As he poured himself another cup of coffee, his phone buzzed on the table, startling him. It was a text from Sophia. "Stay longer than expected. Jennifer needed help with something else. I'll call you later." Ethan's stomach tightened. There was a sense of finality in her words, something that made him feel like he was being pushed out of the loop. And that's when the thought hit him. What if she's not with Jennifer at all? The doubt, once just a whisper, roared in his ears. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his jacket, slipping out of the house and into the cold air. He had to know the truth. Ethan wasn't sure what he was expecting when he arrived at Jennifer's house, but it wasn't what he found. The lights were on, but there were no signs of Sophia's car, no evidence that she had been there at all. A knot formed in his throat. "Where is she?" He hesitated, then made the decision that would change everything. He didn't know if he was being paranoid, but something inside told him to trust his instincts. So he drove back to their house. His heart pounded as he approached the driveway, the familiar outline of their home looming in the distance. When he stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet. A shiver ran down his spine. He checked the kitchen, the living room, and then the bedroom, where he froze, his blood running cold. Sophia was in their bed, but she wasn't alone. Daniel, her affair partner, was lying beside her, both of them tangled in the sheets, their bodies entwined. Ethan's heart shattered in a single, suffocating moment. The truth was undeniable, and in that instant, all of the doubt he'd been pushing away fell into place with brutal clarity. Sophia's betrayal was real, and as they stirred, waking to the sound of his voice, Ethan's world shattered. The silence in the bedroom was deafening. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of what he had just seen crashing down on him. His hand still gripped the doorframe, as if it could somehow anchor him to the reality he had known, but everything had changed in that instant. His breath caught in his throat, each inhale a jagged gasp. The suffocating pressure of disbelief threatening to collapse his chest. Sophia and Daniel were tangled together, oblivious to his presence, the intimacy of the scene an unbearable violation. Ethan's eyes moved over the bed, the sight of their bodies intertwined filling him with a deep, gnawing rage. Sophia's blonde hair, so carefully arranged just hours before, now lay in a mess of disarray. Her face half turned toward Daniel, her eyes closed in a contentment that Ethan had never seen directed at him. And Daniel, smug, self-assured, with that same cocky grin he had always worn when he visited, unaware of the storm that was brewing. Yeah, the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on him. He thought he might faint or throw up. Anything but stay rooted to the spot, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he stood there, a witness to the destruction of everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in. A moment passed before Daniel's eyes flicked open, and in that moment, he registered Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression didn't falter. If anything, it was one of recognition, a twisted sort of acknowledgement that told Ethan everything he needed to know. The audacity of Daniel's smile was enough to ignite the fury that had been building in Ethan's chest. The bastard didn't even look sorry. He didn't even look guilty. Sophia stirred beside him, groggily blinking awake. The haze of sleep quickly melted away as she processed the scene before her. The blood drained from her face, and for a split second, the mask of composure slipped. There was no denial, no defensiveness in her eyes, only a flash of shock, then a glimmer of panic. Yet, her voice trembled, but it wasn't the apologetic tremble he had expected. It was the tone of someone who had just been caught, a tone that was more concerned with salvaging her own skin than acknowledging the hurt she had inflicted. "What are you—" The words died in her throat when Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and measured, though every syllable vibrated with barely contained fury. "How long?" He didn't shout, but the force of the question still reverberated through the room. He wanted to feel the weight of it, the deep ache in his chest that felt as though it were tearing him apart from the inside. "How long have you been lying to me, Sophia?" She pulled the sheets closer to her chest, her eyes flicking nervously to Daniel, but he didn't move, didn't even flinch. Instead, he just looked at Ethan with a look of smug superiority as though he had already won. I can explain," Sophia stammered, her voice faltering. "Explain?" Ethan echoed, his tone laced with incredulity. "Explain what exactly? That you've been sleeping with him in our bed? In my house?" His words hit the air with the weight of bricks, each one heavier than the last. Sophia's cheeks flushed with shame, but the arrogance in her eyes, the way she lifted her chin, told him everything. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't regretful. She was simply caught. And now she had to find a way out. "I never meant for it to happen like this," she began, her voice soft, but her words rehearsed. "Ethan, No," Ethan interrupted, his heart racing. Don't try to justify it. Don't try to make this my fault." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan raised his hand, silencing her. He could see the gears turning in her mind, could hear the excuses she was ready to spit out, but he wasn't going to listen anymore. He had already heard enough. "You really think I'd just believe you?" he sneered. "That this whole thing, your lies, your betrayal, was all just some mistake? No? You planned this, didn't you? Every late night, every secret phone call, every time you told me you were working late or going to help a friend. You had it all lined up, didn't you?" Sophia's face turned pale, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she glanced nervously at Daniel, her eyes silently pleading with him. Daniel, however, looked completely unbothered by the situation, his posture still relaxed, as if the confrontation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You don't understand," Sophia began again, her voice now trembling slightly. I wasn't happy, Ethan. It wasn't enough for me anymore. I needed something more." Ethan's stomach churned as her words pierced through the air. She wasn't happy. That was the excuse she was using, not the truth. Not the years of loyalty and devotion he had shown her. Not the love he had given, unquestioning, unwavering. It was never enough. He took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with the rage that was finally bubbling to the surface. "So you thought you could fix it by betraying me? By sleeping with someone else in our bed?" His voice shook with fury. "And you thought you could get away with it, didn't you? Pretend it was nothing, pretend I would never find out? Well, guess what? I know now, and I'm done." Sophia opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening. It was then that Daniel finally spoke, his voice light, casual, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of a marriage. "Look, man, it's not that big of a deal. We're both adults. You can't really blame her for wanting more, right?" He chuckled, as if he was amused by Ethan's anger. "You should have seen the way she looked at me. She wasn't happy with you. She was just waiting for someone like me to come along. Ethan's jaw clenched so tightly that it hurt. He wanted to say something, anything, to wipe the smug look off Daniel's face, but his words died in his throat. There was no point. He had already lost. Everything he had thought was real. The love, the trust, the years he'd spent building a life with Sophia. Sophia looked at him now, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. But it was too late for apologies. Too late for anything. Ethan had already made his decision. The marriage was over. Ethan sat in the living room, his heart pounding as he tried to steady his breathing. He had left the bedroom after Sophia's failed attempts at excuses, the air in the house heavy with the aftermath of their confrontation. Every corner of the room held memories, echoes of laughter, and the life they had built together, now tainted by the betrayal he could no longer ignore. As he sank into the couch, the enormity of the situation began to settle over him like a suffocating weight. He had never imagined himself here in his own home, unraveling the lies that had been woven into the fabric of their marriage. The betrayal was so complete, so intricate, that it felt as though Sophia had been living a double life right under his nose. The encounter with denial. Sophia emerged from the bedroom, now dressed in a hastily thrown-on bathrobe. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if searching for an escape. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Ethan," she began, her voice shaky but deliberate. "We need to talk about this. You're misunderstanding." "Don't," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. He didn't look at her, instead staring straight ahead at the blank television screen. "Don't insult me by pretending there's anything to misunderstand." Sophia's eyes welled with tears. She stepped closer, her tone growing more desperate. "It wasn't what it looked like, I swear. It's complicated." Ethan finally turned to face her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Complicated?" he spat. "You were in our bed with another man. What part of that am I supposed to misunderstand, Sophia?" She flinched at his words but didn't back down. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake, just a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Ethan rose from the couch, towering over her. His anger surged, but he kept his voice low, almost eerily calm. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. A mistake is not carrying on an affair in our home." The attempt to shift blame. Sophia's tears spilled over as she struggled to find her footing. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I was lonely, Ethan. You've been so, distant lately. Always at work, always busy with everything except me." Ethan's laugh was hollow, bitter. "So this is my fault now? Is that the angle you're going for? I worked hard to provide for us, Sophia, for you. Don't you dare try to make this about me." She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "I'm not trying to blame you. Things haven't been right between us for a while. I didn't know how to fix it." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So you fixed it by bringing him here?" He gestured toward the bedroom. "By betraying me in the most personal way possible?" A moment of silence. The room fell into a heavy silence broken only by the sound of Sophia's quiet sobs. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing with memories, moments he had cherished, now reframed by her deceit. He thought of the anniversary dinners, the vacations, the nights spent laughing in this very room. How much of it had been real? How much of it had been a lie? Confronting the affair partner. Before he could process his thoughts further, there was a noise from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of someone fumbling with their belongings. "Daniel." Ethan's jaw tightened as the man appeared in the doorway, now dressed and looking sheepish but unrepentant. "Look, man," Daniel began, his tone casual, as if he were addressing a minor inconvenience rather than the husband of the woman he had been sleeping with. "I think we should all just calm down and get out," Ethan said, his voice sharp and cutting. He stepped toward Daniel, his stance firm and unyielding. "You have no right to be here. Get out of my house." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Sophia as if waiting for her to intervene, but she remained silent, her face a mask of guilt and fear. Realizing he wouldn't find an ally, Daniel shrugged and began to retreat. "Unbelievable," Ethan muttered as he watched Daniel leave, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, a final punctuation mark on the chaos of the night. A decision takes shape. Ethan turned back to Sophia, who had collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. He stared at her for a long moment, his mind churning with questions he didn't know if he wanted answers. "Is he the only one?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but unwavering. Sophia looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Yes," she whispered. I swear, Ethan. He's the only one. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. And how long? Sophia hesitated, then spoke so softly he almost didn't hear her. A few months. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as the weight of her confession settled over him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was all too much. But beneath it all, a sense of clarity began to emerge. This wasn't something he could forgive. It wasn't something he could move past. I'll be staying at a hotel tonight, Ethan said finally, his tone flat. Don't expect me back anytime soon. Sophia's sobs grew louder as Ethan grabbed his keys and coat, the sound of her cries following him as he walked out the door. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it was a welcome reprieve from the suffocating tension inside. As he climbed into his car and started the engine, Ethan felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He was done living in a lie. Ethan spent the night in a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town. The room was cold and impersonal, its beige walls and threadbare carpet a stark contrast to the warmth and familiarity of the home he had left behind. Sleep eluded him as his thoughts churned endlessly, replaying every moment of the betrayal and the confrontation that followed. By morning, the reality of his situation felt heavier than ever. The man who had spent years building a life, a home, and a partnership now found himself untethered, drifting in a sea of uncertainty. But as he stared at the faint light filtering through the dusty curtains, Ethan knew he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Decisions had to be made. A call for help. Before leaving the motel, Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed the one person he could trust without question. His sister, Caroline. She answered on the second ring, her familiar voice a balm to his frayed nerves. Ethan, what's wrong? She asked, concern evident in her tone. Ethan hesitated, swallowing the lump in his throat. It's Sophia, he finally said. She's been cheating on me. Caroline inhaled sharply but didn't interrupt. She let him pour out the story, every agonizing detail, spilling from him like water breaking through a dam. When he was finished, there was a moment of silence before she spoke. Even I'm so sorry, she said softly. You don't deserve this. What can I do? I need to talk to someone, he admitted. Someone who won't try to sugarcoat things. You're not alone, Caroline said firmly. Come over. We'll figure this out together. Seek console. By mid-morning, Ethan was sitting in Caroline's cozy living room, a mug of hot coffee in his hands. She listened as he unpacked everything again, her face a mixture of sympathy and quiet anger. What are you going to do? She asked once he had finished. I don't know, Ethan admitted. Part of me wants to pack up her things and toss them on the lawn. Another part of me just wants to walk away and never look back. Caroline nodded thoughtfully. Whatever you decide, don't rush it. You're angry and hurt right now, and that's not the time to make permanent decisions. But whatever you do, make sure it's what's best for you, not her, not anyone else. Her words struck a chord, and Ethan realized how much of himself he had lost in trying to keep the marriage afloat. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the realization that he had been putting Sophia's needs above his own for far too long. Unpacking the past. Later that day, Ethan returned to the house, dreading the confrontation he knew awaited him. Sophia was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a tissue in her hand, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red from crying. Ethan, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I said it, he said, his voice steady but cold. I'm not here to listen to more excuses. I'm here to talk about what happens next. Sophia's eyes filled with fresh tears. I don't want to lose you, she said, her voice trembling. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling. Ethan shook his head. This isn't something you can fix with therapy, Sophia. You broke my trust, and I don't know if I can ever get that back. But I love you, she pleaded. I made a mistake, but that doesn't erase everything we've been through together. Ethan's jaw tightened. Love isn't just about words, Sophia. It's about actions, and your actions told me everything I need to know. The turning point. As their conversation continued, it became clear to Ethan that Sophia wasn't ready to take full responsibility for her actions. She shifted blame, deflected, and tried to minimize the affair, painting it as a momentary lapse rather than the calculated betrayal it truly was. You can't just walk away from us, she said at one point, her voice rising with desperation. We've built a life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It did, Ethan said quietly. But you're the one who walked away first. You just didn't have the decency to tell me." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sophia seemed to grasp the finality of what was happening. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded reluctantly, taking control. Over the next few days, Ethan began the painful process of disentangling himself from the life he and Sophia had built. He contacted a lawyer to discuss the logistics of separation, prepared to divide their assets and start fresh. Sophia, meanwhile, alternated between apologizing profusely and lashing out, her emotions swinging wildly as she tried to process the unraveling of her world. Ethan stayed firm, refusing to be swayed by her outbursts or her tears. He knew he couldn't let her manipulate him into staying, not when the foundation of their marriage had been so thoroughly shattered. A glimmer of hope. Amid the chaos, Ethan found unexpected moments of clarity. He began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under years of compromise and sacrifice. He reached out to old friends, reconnected with hobbies he had abandoned, and began envisioning a future that wasn't defined by his role as Sophia's husband. One evening, as he sat alone on the back porch, the stars glittering above, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from resolution or closure. Those were still a long way off. But it was the peace of knowing he had made the right choice for himself. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt free. Ethan sat in his new apartment, a modest but comfortable space that lacked the echoes of betrayal that had filled his old home. The hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the stifling silence he had left behind, but it was a welcome change. Boxes were still piled in the corners, a mix of essentials he had brought with him and items he had chosen to reclaim as his own. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of control over his life, even if it was still fragile. I made it back to when I met my wife. The legal closure of the separation process had been a grueling ordeal. Sophia had fought tooth and nail, oscillating between demanding forgiveness and threatening to drag out the proceedings. Ethan's lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Laura, had been his anchor during this time. She had reminded him again and again to focus on his own future rather than Sophia's chaos. "I know it's exhausting," Laura said during one meeting, "but you're doing the right thing. You're taking back your life." By the time the papers were signed and their assets divided, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. His marriage was officially over, and while the thought brought a sting of sadness, it was outweighed by the knowledge that he was finally free of the lies that had tainted it. Rebuilding himself. Ethan began to focus on rebuilding not just his life, but himself. He threw himself into his work, taking on new projects that reignited his passion and reminded him of his own competence. Colleagues began to notice the change in him. "You seem lighter," one of them commented over lunch one day. "Like a weight's been lifted." "No." Ethan smiled faintly, realizing it was true. The weight of mistrust, doubt, and constant vigilance was gone. In its place was the quiet satisfaction of moving forward. Outside of work, he began reconnecting with old friends, people he had neglected during the latter years of his marriage. Caroline encouraged him to join her at local events, introducing him to new people and new opportunities. One weekend, she dragged him to a hiking meetup, something he never would have considered before. As they climbed a steep trail surrounded by strangers who were slowly becoming friends, Ethan felt his lungs burn and his muscles strain. But the view from the summit was worth it. A sprawling vista of green and gold, stretching far beyond the horizon. "This is what life is about," Caroline said, grinning at him. "Moments like this." Ethan nodded, his breath steadying as he took it all in. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive, an unexpected connection. One of the hiking group members, a woman named Lily, began to stand out to Ethan over time. She was kind and grounded, with a quiet strength that drew him in. They started chatting more during meetups, their conversations ranging from their favorite books to shared struggles and dreams. Lily wasn't someone who demanded attention, but she commanded it through her authenticity. One evening, after a group dinner, she lingered as the others left. They walked together under the soft glow of streetlights, their conversation deepening with each step. "I know you've been through a lot," Lily said gently, "but you seem like someone who's still willing to believe in the good." That's rare. Her words stayed with Ethan long after they parted ways. He wasn't ready to dive into anything new, but for the first time, he allowed himself to think that maybe, someday, he could trust again. Sophia's last attempt. Not long after the divorce was finalized, Sophia reached out. Her voice on the phone was tentative, a shadow of the confident woman Ethan had once known. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone careful, "about everything that happened. I need you to know I'm sorry. Truly." Ethan listened in silence, his emotions a mixture of frustration and pity. He had waited so long for this acknowledgement. But now that it was here, it felt hollow. "I appreciate that, Sophia," he said finally, his voice steady. "But it doesn't change anything. Can we at least try to be friends?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Ethan took a deep breath. "I think it's best we move on separately. I wish you well, but I need to focus on my own life now." Sophia didn't argue. She simply sighed and hung up, leaving Ethan with a sense of finality he hadn't realized he needed. Looking ahead, months passed, and Ethan began to settle into his new normal. His mornings were filled with runs through the city park, his evenings with books and quiet reflection. The simplicity of his routine was comforting, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos he had endured. Every now and then, memories of Sophia would resurface, her laughter, her touch, the life they had shared. But rather than pain, these memories now brought a sense of closure. They were part of his story, but they no longer defined. One crisp autumn evening, as Ethan sat on his balcony with a cup of tea, he realized something profound. He was happy. Not in the fleeting, surface-level way he had been before, but in a deep, enduring way. He had faced the worst and he had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more himself than ever. Ethan smiled to himself, the cool air filling his lungs as the city lights twinkled below. This was his life now, and for the first time in years, it felt entirely his own.